Please be seated. The Honorable Legislative Assembly has resumed its sitting. When we took the evening break, the member for Georgetown Central was speaking to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes in life, everything happens for a reason, and I am so glad that that little break happened when it did. Mr. Speaker, I was glad to have some conversations with some of the members of government, and particularly that of the Premier, to feel comforted that there will be some positive change in, by way of some of the amendments, and there seems to be more of a viewpoint on what is more liking to the people based on feedback that I've received from the public. It also gave me an opportunity to take a little breather, because some of the good Premier's strategies, even though he still advises me how to become a good politician, he uses some of the old tactics to get me off track. But I'm back on track now, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think that majority of the concerns that we have in respect to this bill could be summed up in the one word, and that word is trust. Because I don't think anybody in this Honorable House is disputing whether we want a regiment or not, because I remember even talking on the public radio and saying that when the first announcements of this regiment was highlighted by the Premier and the Governor, there wasn't an outcry going, no, we don't want a regiment, we don't want a regiment. It's only until the bill itself was released and the contents of the bill and what it said, when we started to hear many people being concerned about the bill. So it tells me that majority of the people in the Cayman Islands are not opposed to a regiment. But none of us knew what the formulation of a regiment would look like. And when I get back to the word of trust, it has a lot to do with the fact that this bill has a lot of responsibility in the hands of the governor. And compiled with the fact that we had a recent bill which was rather controversial and many people not liking that, I think that has transferred over to this bill a little bit. But also by the governor himself creating this current heated environment in respect to this bill, because the governor himself has caused so many false promotions. And when I say false promotions, I would say not necessarily false in what he said wasn't true, but what he said and what ended up coming in the bill seemed to be two different worlds. Or it seemed to be promoting only some parts of what this regiment would be about, and sometimes could be even seen as disingenuous, because particularly for me, Mr. Speaker, was at one of the press briefings when he was asked about the military arm of the regiment, and he outright denied, saying that this is not a military and they're not soldiers. And granted, we're not calling them soldiers, but even in the bill it refers to military and soldiers and the like. So that would create that added pressure that we already are dealing with in many people's eyes from his last action of Section 81, where many people disapprove. Some people agreed with it, but many didn't. And Mr. Speaker, some of the other parts of this bill that caused that attitude towards this bill to be on the defensive, pun intended, is the fact that our Premier or our leader of opposition was not on the board. And the board I'm speaking of, Mr. Speaker, is the Defense Board. In any democracy, with anything as severe and as significant as a group of people having the ability to have arms in a nation, the people would want to know that their voice is there in some capacity, some way, shape, or form. And the only voice that the people have in our democracy that they are held accountable to is that of the elected arm. And Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Leader of Opposition constitutionally represents this Honorable House and all the members in it. So, Mr. Speaker, I will definitely be supporting some of the amendments that seek to ensure that the Honorable Premier, at the very least, if not both the Honorable Premier and the Leader of the Opposition, be appointed or designated of theirs to the Defense Board. Mr. Speaker, another area of this bill that I think, if after many of the concerns that were highlighted be accepted, I've heard the Deputy Governor saying that many of the concerns that was raised by my colleagues will be considered, and I'm assuming considered meaning willing to accept. If they are accepted, I think we could resolve many of the fears and concerns that we have. But there's one that I haven't heard mentioned that I would like to see involved, and it has to do with the embodiment of the regiment. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to agree with the Honorable Premier that our reading of Clause 28 could be misconstrued, particularly that of 28.3. It reads, "The Governor shall seek the agreement of the Premier before embodying the regiment for deployment in a foreign state." So what that means is, anywhere else outside of overseas territories, the Governor shall seek agreement. So without the Premier agreeing to it, they can't go. That's what I read that law to mean. But in other areas, it says, "But agreement is not required for deployment within the islands or other British overseas territories." Now, the other British overseas territories, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to list them now, is Anguilla, Bermuda, British Antarctic Territory, British Indian Ocean Territory, Cayman Islands, Falkland Island, Gibraltar, Montserrat, Pitcairn, Henderson. Well, some of these places I didn't even know existed. St. Helena, South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, sovereign base area of, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but and Cyprus, Turks and Caicos Islands, and the Virgin Islands. Now, those are British overseas territories. Some of these places, some of our people may not even be aware of. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think there should be an option, particularly depending on the circumstances, that considering the fact of the role of this regiment is the defense of the islands, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, that most people, because it was sold by the Governor and many other counterparts, that it was more focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. That if a circumstance in one of these overseas territories becomes so hostile and the Governor chooses to, without the necessary permission or agreement by the Premier, that our volunteers should have the right to decline deployment. Because I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation, Mr. Speaker. Let's just say, let me pick an island. I'm not particularly going to say any one that is bad, but let's say, for instance, Bermuda, who has been known for strenuous situations, particularly that between the British and the Bermuda nationals, and a riot happens over there, and the people start to fight for their independence or what have you. And the Governor says, we want you to go down to Bermuda and to be in a conflicting situation. Now, as I said before, most people who sign up to this regiment sign up with the first priority being providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So if they may find themselves where the environment or the circumstances become really, really hostile, at the very least, they should have the option to decline if those circumstances have been met. Now, Mr. Speaker, the next cohort of what do you call them again? Pardon me, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The next cohort of recruits, the reason why I'm bringing this up, Mr. Speaker, is because the first cohort of recruits didn't know and was not told about this law. Based on my research, talking to them, they signed up to a regiment without knowing the finer details of their obligation. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been told that that's not necessarily the case. But Mr. Speaker, I've been told that the regiment members have all agreed to the parameters of what this law outlines, which is situations like being deployed in overseas territories without the agreement of the premier, and that could be in a rather hostile situation where they may have to bear arms. Now, if they've been told that, then, that was nobody forced them to do that. So if that's the case, then my point may not be valid. But based on my feedback with persons I've been told, it seems as if they weren't of that understanding. Now, if they were, for those who I spoke to, maybe if the premier is correct that they were told that, then I guess I'll be happy to see if the premier would present to this honorable House a copy of a blank agreement of all recruits that have to sign that outlines the fact that they would be subject to such circumstances as being deployed to hostile, potentially military circumstances, or no, I wouldn't say military, but armed circumstances, so they would know what they're getting into as being a part of the regiment. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other part that is of paramount importance to me is, and I think the honorable member from Northside touched on this already, was ensuring that Caymanians, and I'm not talking just like how we do it with jobs in Cayman, but this is a very serious thing. You're talking about a group of individuals who have the qualities of a military, and I think I don't need to dwell more on how significant that is, that whoever is going up the ranks within the ranks of the regiment should be Caymanian. Now, I agree that maybe in the first couple of years that may be difficult, and I know that because when speaking to my colleagues in Bermuda, he reminded me that was the similar circumstances they had to deal with when they first started their regiment, because they did not have the qualified individuals on their island. But as the years progressed, they ensured that the people who were moving up the ranks of the regiment were people from Bermuda. And I think that we have to do exactly the same. But it can't be the ensuring like how we ensure that Caymanians get jobs, because we're not doing a very good job about that, Mr. Speaker. So the area that is concerned with the rank and file, I will have more to say when we get to committee stage. Mr. Speaker, this bill is another example, or this hostile debate and discussions in the public is another example of our tense relationship that has evolved over the last couple of years with the UK. And I would take this opportunity to say to the representatives of the UK locally, you have to be so mindful with the words that you say, because the words that you say will be interpreted as to what the intention of the United Kingdom will be. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean, Mr. Speaker. The Honorable Premier, in his opening remarks, spoke about what it would have been like to have had a regiment, say, when the earthquake happened and when the fire happened and the like. And it sparked a memory for me, Mr. Speaker. Because when we had the earthquake, Mr. Speaker, we had also a tsunami warning right after. And Mr. Speaker, I represent the constituency of Georgetown Central. And Mr. Speaker, Georgetown Central has a lot of low-lying areas, and it's very close to the coast. For the first time in recent history that I'm aware of, we had a tsunami warning, and most people know that when you get a tsunami alert, you have a matter of minutes before you have to find safety. Nothing like a hurricane where you have notice for days to prepare yourself, to find shelter, to find food, emergency aid, medication, all those things, to prepare yourself for that disaster. You have minutes. Now, Mr. Speaker, you also know that the government building, which is owned by the people of the Cayman Islands, who their taxpayers paid for, is right next to my constituency, that being particularly Martin Drive, Scranton, and North Sound Road, Eastern Avenue, Shedden Road. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government building is the only building that had the heights necessary to protect yourself from a tsunami. And I'm slowly going to get to the point about the importance of the governor minding his words, or the representatives of the UK and what they say. Because, Mr. Speaker, right after the tsunami warning, just like all the elected members here in the House, I was out checking on my people to make sure everybody was okay after the earthquake, making sure that no houses were, falling down. Nobody knew the extent of the damage until some hours later, the next day later. But we were all checking on our people, calling. The phone lines are jammed up. Traffic was crazy. And then I had a report from some of my constituents in Scranton that when they got the alert for the tsunami warning, they did the natural thing to do, was to run over to the government building because they had nowhere else to run to. And they were turned away from the government building, Mr. Speaker. Something I was not happy with at all, but I inquired about it and I was told by the cabinet secretary that they were sorry. It was a security guard that was non-Caymanian and didn't really understand our culture here. And if it was a Caymanian security guard, they would have let them in. I said, okay, I accept your apology, but I need to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So myself and the opposition members, excluding the member from Northside, met with the governor the day after to speak about the response to the earthquake. And just to make sure that that fear of being turned away by my good people of Georgetown Central from the government building, ever if there was a tsunami warning, I asked the governor, I said, Governor, I have a little concern. When we were speaking about the other things, about the response and what people need to do, I said, some of my people came to the government building and was turned away when the tsunami warning happened. And he says, oh, I was aware of that. I heard so, and we apologize. I said, thank you very much. I accept the apology. But my concern is not about the apology, but I want to make sure that this does not happen again. Now, the governor responded to me by saying that he can't promise that can't happen again because this is a security center and that not everybody can come into this building. I said, so my good people of Georgetown Central, who have no other government buildings surrounding them that they can get to within minutes, what are they expected to do? And the response by the governor was for them to find the highest spot and get to it. The governor told me to go and tell the people of Georgetown Central that if a tsunami warning comes, that they must go find the highest spot. And they paid for the government building with their taxpayers' money. Mr. Speaker, that is the highest spot in Georgetown. It was built specifically that height for those types of reasons. And Mr. Speaker, that's what creates these types of attitude of distrust. How am I expected to support a bill gives him full control of such a powerful arm of individuals when I ask about simple things like making sure that my people have access to a building that is high enough to protect them from a tsunami warning, when he tells me must go tell them, must go find the highest point.
Honorable member, be mindful of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will close down that element of my discussion now. And just to say, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my colleague, the opposition leader, to say, and the leader and the member from North Side, to say, this is all about the governor. And in this current environment in the Cayman Islands where our trust relationship with the UK is at ends, nobody can expect any other reaction than the reaction that we're getting in respect to this bill. And I expect that the amendments that have been proposed to be accepted, because you can't expect to have such a control on the regiment, even though it's within the defense bill. Bearing in mind, the governor said, this is our regiment. And if it is our regiment, then we want our representatives having more say about what the regiment does. That's the key component. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to touch another area before I close up about the cost. Now, it's one that I'm only raising from a perspective of it's something that many people in the community have raised, not only by the common ones on the radio, by other people who came to the meeting, other persons who sent me emails, maybe because of their distrust with the UK and its representative, why they're finding anything to try to put a position on this bill, but it is a justified one. The fact that we're going to, at a time when things are very, very slim by way of cost, what do we expect this cost to be going forward yearly? Because we're starting out, and I see that there's another bill which I don't want to necessarily refer to because it's against the standing orders, but we have another bill coming that speaks to how much money is going to be asked for this regiment. And we're talking about 1.3 million, and that's just to start things up. As the membership grows and as the offices grow and the responsibilities grow, the cost is going to increase. So I don't know if the government can give a stronger estimation of what would be the recurring costs per year, say for instance when it's at full force. Because at a time when we're going $25 million deficit, a $25 million deficit per month based on statements by the government members, some people will question that. Some people will question that and say, is it something that we need at this particular moment? But I recognize that there are Caymanians who've already given their commitment to this and will see an opportunity in this. So I am willing to support that spending to give the Caymanians that opportunity to represent their country in disaster relief and, God forbid, defense of the Cayman Islands. Because we never know what tomorrow may bring. Nobody knows what tomorrow will bring. So there may be a situation where defense of these islands is necessary. And as the bill says, it's also assisting the police force and the Coast Guard. And anything that can assist the Coast Guard to stop the illegal guns coming in this country and illegal substances coming in this country, I will definitely support. So to say that the regiment is not necessary is a far-fetched, but the question about the monies at a time when we don't have much is legitimate, and the people should know that this is not something we cannot handle, that we will have enough money to sustain this, because in the bigger picture, though $1.3 million for the year may sound like a lot to the average person, but when you think about a yearly budget of almost $1 billion, it's small in the scheme of things for the benefits that we may receive. Mr. Speaker, I only ask in my closing that can any representative of the government or even the Attorney General can explain where and under what law do we have the ability, and this is not necessarily for the bill itself, but just so the common man understands what the necessity of having retroactive legislation, because that is probably the number one thing outside of the governor having the absolute say of this regiment that has drawn concern by most people I spoke to, which is the dangers of having a law enacted to go backwards. And I question again, as I said before earlier on, hesitantly, because I don't want to do repetition, but the question has to be answered. If it is legal, what the governor did, why does this bill have to be retroactive? That needs to be explained so the common man understands the benefit of retroactive legislation. And why is it necessary? And why are we even using it now? Why were we not prepared before? So with that being said, Mr. Speaker, let me just double check I've covered all my points. Only one more, Mr. Speaker, in respect to the Deputy Governor's debate. He said that there is no hidden agenda and there is no conspiracy theory. Though that may be true, Mr. Speaker, it is difficult for people not to jump to those conclusions when false promotions or misleading promotions happen and lack of consultation, because the truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, if we had more discussions about this bill with the people of the Cayman Islands, they, meaning the governor's office and the elected arm, would know that there is about 25% of this bill that needs to be amended for it to be a Caymanian regiment. I don't understand how we are calling it the Cayman Regiment without the involvement of the Caymanian people. So with that being said, Mr. Speaker, hopefully that will help in respect to the discussion, and I look forward to the meeting after this debate to go through some of the things that I myself would like to see changed on behalf of the people of the Cayman Islands, but particularly those of Georgetown Central. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer a brief contribution with respect to the Defense Bill 2020, and noting the hour, certainly it will be my goal to be as brief as possible. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by acknowledging, as the Honorable Deputy Governor did, the 51 reservists that make up the 1st platoon of the Cayman Islands Regiment, by adding only one to the Honorable Deputy Governor's number. There are, in fact, as I understand it, 41 Caymanians, or 80%, of whom are Caymanian. 3 are spouses of Caymanians, so that would only increase that percentage. 2 are permanent residents, 4 are Jamaican, and 1 is a British national. Together they represent a cross-section of our society, and individually they have brought diverse talents, energy, and discipline to bear in support of ultimately establishing the regiment as a center for excellence. Mr. Speaker, over the past recent months, I have had the pleasure and benefit of engaging with some of the volunteer reservists and officers of the regiment, many of which have shared their personal experiences. Mr. Speaker, it is clear, despite some of the negative and frankly short-sighted comments that have recently been shared in the media, and perhaps some of the misrepresentations of the bill made as part of this debate, it is clear to me, and certainly to those 51 reservists that make up Cayman's 1st platoon, that we are at the beginning of what many believe will be looked back on as a pioneering policy through which Caymanians can proudly contribute to the advancement of this country's security, resilience, and prosperity. I want to certainly thank the honorable members of this House who have spoken before me. Some I agree with, many I do not. On the ones that I do not, certainly if I can address some of those comments now, Mr. Speaker. It would appear, at least from my understanding, that many members of the opposition, both the official and non-official, have focused heavily on the defensive role of the Cayman Regiment, and in particular their view that this defensive role is one of an aggressor or fighting force, whereas the bill, in actual fact, in my view, as well as that of the crafters of the bill, takes on a more peacekeeping role than that of a fighting force. The member from Northside asserted that members of the regiment could be called to wage war in Angola, while he and others raised questions of the use of firearms training or the component requiring military training as proof that what is being proposed will be a fighting force, and as such, not as advertised. The leader of the opposition stated that military trained defense service means to fight and to kill. I believe he used the words killing machines, I think he can be quoted as saying. Well, let's look at the bill, Mr. Speaker, and see what it actually says in regard to these things. Clause 3, as outlined in the objects and reasons, and can be found on page 3 and again on page 16, states that, or provides that a member of the regiment may be required to perform military service, including training and non-combatant services, both outside and inside the islands. Non-combatant services. Section 6, paragraph 20, which can be found on page 24, deals with the military training aspect, which includes things like participation in a boot camp and the requirement to attend at least 40 drills as part of their training exercises. All of which, in my view, Mr. Speaker, seek to instill discipline as a primary objective, not necessarily war fighting ability, as some would have us believe. Military training and non-combatant services, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at the definition of non-combatant. According to Webster's dictionary, non-combatant is a noun, and it means a person who is not engaged in fighting during a war. So very clear, Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Regiment is not an aggressor, not a combatant, and certainly not a fighting force. Full stop. Certainly not a killing machine, Mr. Speaker. So why do we call it a regiment? Why do we establish it under military guidelines? Surely the word military implies fighting of some kind. Mr. Speaker, it may surprise you to know that there exists within the United Kingdom military complex 210 regiments, corps, and units, all who undergo the same training, which in my mind, like the Coast Guard, means that officers in these ranks are interchangeable. However, not all are fighting or aggressor type forces, albeit they carry the same name and similar training strategies. I'll give you an example. We have the Logistics and Support Regiment, whose primary concern is how, where, when, and how things happen. We have the Armored Medical Regiment, providing medical services both on and off the battlefield. We have the Signals Regiment, Mr. Speaker, whose primary role is to deal with communications. We have the Royal Engineering Regiment, dealing with construction and engineering. And we have the Aviation Supply Squadron, providing and maintaining aviation equipment. All very military-sounding departments, regiments, and units, but all, much like the Cayman Islands Regiment, receiving the same training, requiring the same boot camp, requiring the same drill instruction, are still all trained with firearms, but whose primary role and function is that of providing very different and uniquely necessary and important services, non-combatant services. So, Mr. Speaker, let us get back to what the Cayman Regiment and the subsequent defense bill, which we are debating here today, really provides. By virtue of our geographic location, Mr. Speaker, it could be said that the people of these islands are keenly aware and susceptible to threats, disasters, and catastrophes, the consequences of which put lives and/or the livelihoods of these persons at great risk, and has the potential, and oftentimes does, to exceed the ability of our own society to cope with. In turn, we are too familiar with disaster relief, which is essentially, by definition, the organized response to alleviate the effects of catastrophe and thereby save life, relieve suffering, limit damage, restore essential services, and generally support the conditions for safety, stability, and recovery. For many years, Mr. Speaker, we have, as a jurisdiction, responsibly reaffirmed our understanding and embrace of measures that enhance national capacity to manage risks and the challenges arriving from any number of circumstances that together have destabilizing effects. In particular, we have consistently sought to prepare these islands and its people to handle adversity. To that end, Mr. Speaker, we have built and continue to refine and should always, in my opinion, strive to enhance our strategic policies on disaster preparedness and security. And in this spirit, Mr. Speaker, the Defense Bill and the development of the Cayman Regiment of these islands in general is another example of the continuation of such strategic efforts. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, many defense forces around the world, including those branches of the United Kingdom, as I mentioned earlier, are involved in mission type and skill sets to now play a role in the delivery of humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and support and security support to existing civilian structures. A principal driver for this cooperation between military and civilian mechanisms rests with the notion that military personnel can potentially bring both unique and complementary skill sets to a disaster zone, which can yield significant efficiencies and effectiveness. As is the case, Mr. Speaker, in the Cayman Islands, many disaster-prone countries now have national or regional disaster risk management strategies or disaster management plans already implemented to improve their disaster preparedness. I can think of, as examples, Haiti, Panama, Jamaica, Belize, and Costa Rica. I think there are 15 others that I can't recall off the top of my head, but 12 of these Anglophone, Caribbean, and Latin American countries also have established defense and security or peacekeeping regimes. Mr. Speaker, at the helm of our national crisis management mechanism is the Honorable Deputy Governor, who I believe I can say without fear of contradiction serves most ably in this capacity. And at the heart of that mechanism is a multi-agency coordination effort that encompasses key entities from across the public sector, private sector, and civil society, Mr. Speaker, bringing together frontline personnel, essential workers, first responders, and critical operational assets. In this sense, Mr. Speaker, it is easy to imagine that the regiment can potentially play a number of roles as an element of our national resilience, acting in tandem with civilian agencies to supplement the functioning of structures, resources, and skills that become critically strained, if not unable to meet the special demands and risks presented, especially during natural disasters and time of significant catastrophe. I need not tell you we have experienced this for ourselves many times. But because of our resilience, because of our preparations, because of our strategies, we have always, by the grace of God, come out smelling like a rose on the other end. The regiment, Mr. Speaker, and Defense Bill therefore represents, in the government's opinion, a key opportunity for us and provides a platform and legal framework for us to continue to develop and invest in Caymanians by providing a meaningful, modern military experience inclusive of high-quality training, exercises, and professional development. Over the longer term, Mr. Speaker, capacity and resilience as contributed by the regiment will be realized through the abilities of its reservists, as grown through a strategic and robust program of training, drills, mentorship, and professional development that will impart transferable skills. Skills that not only serve, Mr. Speaker, to meet the needs of the regiment, but also create value for our reservists in terms of their civilian employability and career success. Life after the regiment, the skills taught and learned within the regiment will serve to benefit first the jurisdiction, and secondly, the reservists themselves when they seek to pursue their career elsewhere. Hopefully that will be within the uniform branch of service. Certainly I can think of personnel like Lieutenant Theodore Kelly, who was mentioned by the Deputy Governor, personal favorite of mine, who started his career in the Cadet Corps and then thereafter moved into the regiment. And like I said, I think he and others are ideal candidates to move on to the uniform services branch of government. And he, certainly after serving in the regiment and having obtained these necessary career development skill sets, would probably have his pick of the litter. On that point, Mr. Speaker, I am reminded of the recent academic and leadership accomplishments by the regiment's junior officers, all of whom proudly represented their families, their employers, the regiment, and of course, this country by successfully completing the enduring 9-week training course at the world-renowned Royal Military College, Sandhurst. Mr. Speaker, such exposure to training and professional development is an excellent example of the opportunities as accessible through service in the regiment. Opportunities that are intended to develop future commanders, leaders, managers, supervisors, and above all, problem solvers. Not just complainers, Mr. Speaker, but persons who can identify a problem and put forward an alternative solution, something I think this country so badly needs in all walks of life. Again, all brought about as a result of participation in the regiment. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the value of being able to access a reserve of military personnel who are organized, integrated, equipped, trained, and positioned to complement the overarching national security mechanisms already in place. As such, our reservists will inevitably provide essential capability in furtherance of delivering services to our communities in times of critical need and vulnerability, especially as it relates to ensuring public order, providing disaster relief, and delivering humanitarian aid, as is the intention of this bill. Mr. Speaker, many of us will recall times when we were faced with the aftermath of disaster. Certainly Hurricane Ivan has not erased itself from my memory, and I'm sure neither has it been erased from any members of this House. Or found ourselves, along with our families and neighbors, exposed to a sudden, potentially catastrophic event. I don't know, maybe a fuel storage tank fire, for example. Looking more generally, though, Mr. Speaker, between the year of 2000 and 2019, give or take 20 years, 330 storms have ravaged the Caribbean and Latin America, with an average of 17 hurricanes and 23 Category 5 hurricanes. 2020 so far holds the record with 23 named storms as of September 24th of this year, the most ever recorded in a single season, but now that number past at 25 is the number. That's 8 more than in 2005, the year that previously held that record for a single season. Added to that, Mr. Speaker, this region has experienced 75 earthquakes, 25% of which measured 8.0 or greater on the Richter scale. And of course, like Hurricane Ivan, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, which I'm sure we all also remember, ranks itself among the top 10 deadliest quakes in human history. These are facts. But let's forget about weather for a moment, Mr. Speaker. Certainly we can all relate to the ongoing public health crisis that we presently find ourselves happening in real time, which is requiring unprecedented policy responses, innovative partnerships, and if I may be so bold to say, exceptional leadership. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, the people of these islands fully grasp and appreciate how important it is for us to put in place plans, structures, and resources to enable the delivery, continuity, and restoration of essential services in the face of a range of threats, some of which I have sought to highlight today. As a country, our experiences have taught us the value of things such as emergency shelters, water sanitation facilities, distribution of hygiene kits, shoring up roofs with tarpaulin, clearance of road debris, crowd management, and security of critical infrastructure. All services which the Cayman Regiment, as outlined in the bill and certainly at its intent, will be able to provide this jurisdiction. Non-combatant services, but primarily focused on humanitarian aid and disaster recovery and relief. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the development of Cayman's capability and capacity will ultimately enable these islands to better prepare for and endure the challenges that accompany not only disasters, but also other circumstances in the interest of producing effective and efficient responses that save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain human dignity. The regiment, as such, represents an opportunity for this country to continue evolving, to continue adapting, and to continue maturing our resilience, Mr. Speaker, which, as we've come to appreciate, is indeed a fundamental aspect to prosperity and sustainability. I will be giving my support to this bill, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask the other honorable members, now that they are in possession of some of the facts, that they will also do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call now on the Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a most happy note on which to conclude today's proceedings. I move the adjournment of this Honorable House until 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Wednesday, the 21st of October.
Question is that this Honorable House do adjourn until Wednesday next. Wednesday, the 21st of October. All in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This Honorable Legislative Assembly stands adjourned until Wednesday, 21st, 10 a.m.